First and foremost, thank you everyone for joining this webinar, the first of its series, brought to you by the Collective for the Advancement of Connected Buildings in partnership with the Proptech Collective. This series will focus on identifying pathways to expedite Canada's transition to net zero. And in this first webinar, we will explore the relationship between energy, GHG reductions, and the building segment. The Collective for the Advancement of Connected Buildings was formed to provide support with electrification-driven, decarbonization. The mandate of the collective is to provide educational outreach and help form a unified voice in advancing the role of buildings and communities to expedite Canada's transition to net zero. We would like to thank the Proptech Collective for their continuous support. The Proptech Collective is a collective of real estate professionals, technologists, entrepreneurs, and community builders that provide technological innovation can change the world, the built world for the better. Few housekeeping rules, as I heard some noise in the background. Please note that this meeting will be recorded. We kindly ask you to keep your mic and video muted during panel discussions so that we can avoid any echo. During any point of the webinar, you may ask questions in the chat box. I will help facilitate that conversation and all your questions will be answered between 12:30 and 12:50, leaving us with ample time for engagement. As you ask your question, we kindly ask you to please introduce yourself or at least the sector you belong to. And if the question is directed to a particular individual in our panel, we kindly ask you to make note of that. Now, without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you to Alec Dodson, who will help moderate the conversation amongst our esteemed list of panelists. Alec is a senior advisor at Strategy Corp, a leading Canadian public affairs, communication, and management consulting firm. With over 30 years of experience in the energy sector, he has worked as a regulatory lawyer, senior executive in both North America and the UK, chief operating officer at the Ontario Energy Board, and as an advisor to both private and public organizations. During his career, Alec has led organizations and teams through periods of significant change in business strategy and the external operating environment. He has also led meetings and consultations with the public and Indigenous communities, spoken at numerous conferences and academic gatherings, and engaged extensively with public officials and stakeholders in Canada, the US, and the UK. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion, as I'm sure you all are. So without any further ado, Alec, the floor is yours.
I think I've unmuted. Thank you very much, Olta. And just to pick up on the theme of the session today, that we are going to focus, really explore how the building sector and the property tech sector can work with and really within the energy sector to contribute to the achievement of Canada's goals with respect to the reduction of carbon emissions. And, you know, when you think about it, this discussion is really taking place at an interesting juncture. Just a few days ago, we saw the appointment of Canada as Canada's new Minister of the Environment, an individual with very strong and long-standing personal commitment to sustainability objectives. And then looking ahead, we'll have the world leaders will soon be gathering in Glasgow for COP26, which was described in the Guardian newspaper this morning as the make or break climate summit. So in this context, there are clearly some questions that arise about how we're going to make it or break it here in Canada and Ontario. So a number of the questions we want to consider is, how is Canada doing with respect to its own emission targets? What role does or can our energy sector play in the path to decarbonization? And perhaps more specifically for the audience today, what are the building and property tech sectors doing, and what should they do to contribute to achieving our carbon reduction targets? And the four panelists we have are well equipped to participate in a discussion of these questions. And I want to introduce you to the four members of the panel we're going to hear from shortly. The first is Peter Fraser. Peter is head of the gas, coal, and power markets section at the International Energy Agency in Paris. So I know this, for most of us, this is a lunchtime meeting, but for for Peter, I guess it's an evening or a dinner time meeting. This is actually Peter's second sojourn at the IEA, as he was an advisor regarding electricity markets from 1998 to 2004. And between those two stints at the IEA, Peter was a key member of the executive team of the Ontario Energy Board, most recently as Vice President of Consumer Protection and Industry Performance. And Peter really has 30 years of experience, I should say, thought leadership in energy policy in Ontario and globally. The second individual we will hear from is Katherine Sparks. Katherine is Director of Innovation, Research and Development at the Ontario Independent Electricity System Operator, or the ISO, as you will, I suspect, hear it referred to later on. Katherine's team is responsible for initiatives that support the modernization of the electricity grid and the removal of barriers to the deployment of innovative technologies of the type undoubtedly we will talk about later in the discussion, and the deployment of those technologies in the electricity system. Katherine teaches in the Energy and Infrastructure program at Osgoode Hall Law School and does have a direct connection to the building sector. She serves as a board member of Interquality, an organization that is partly owned by the Ontario Home Builders Association. The third member of the panel is Imran Noorani. Imran is an executive, also a connection to the OEB. Imran is an executive with over 15 years of experience in the energy sector. He is currently the Chief Strategy Officer at Peak Power Inc., which is a clean tech company based in Toronto. Peak, as you may know, is a leader in demonstrating how buildings can be integrated into the electricity system by providing services to the grid operator, such as the ISO, and by providing, or rather by reducing costs and establishing new revenue streams by doing so. And Peak's work in this area was recently recognized by the Ontario Energy Association as Company of the Year. The fourth member of the panel is Ali Haas. Ali is an executive with over 15 years of experience working in areas of sustainability and innovation, such as agencies like the ISO, but more recently, Ali is now working as Vice President of Sustainability and Innovation at Triovest, where he's responsible for advancing environmental performance and innovation for a very large portfolio of commercial properties. And Ali's contribution and expertise has been recognized by the Young Energy Professionals Award from the Association of Energy Engineers. And more recently, he was the recipient of the Canada Energy Innovator Award. So those are that's an introduction in respect of the four individuals we're going to hear from. And what I'm proposing to do is pose a question to each of the participants in order, give them an opportunity to respond. We will then turn to questions, and then we will circle back after the audience has had an opportunity to weigh in, to give each of the panelists an opportunity to share some closing observations and perspectives regarding the discussion today. So the first question, or the first panelist I'm going to turn to, is Peter in Paris. And Peter, I think many of us are familiar with the IEA's work and a number of the papers that you have published regarding global energy trends. And I'm thinking specifically of the paper you published a few months ago now about the roadmap to net zero by 2050. And in that paper, you concluded or observed that the energy sector is really key to achieving that objective. And in light of that paper, and I'm interested, I think the panel would be interested, the audience would be interested in better understanding your perspective about how to connect the energy sector with our climate objectives? And perhaps more specifically, what trends do you see globally regarding the contribution that the energy sector can provide?
Well, thank you, Alec, and good afternoon, everybody. In our report that we published in May, Net Zero by 2050, a roadmap for the global energy sector, we really tried to examine what it would take for the global energy system to move from our largely fossil fuel-based system that we have today down to a system which had net zero emissions. And it's quite right, Alec. Of course, energy from the CO2, energy emissions are over 70% of the story when you actually look at global CO2, global greenhouse gas emissions that they'll be talking about in COP26 next week. And so we really wanted, as partly as context for this upcoming meeting, is to demonstrate what it would take to get there, so that a possibility of limiting global warming by 2100 to 1.5 degrees would be possible. So to do that, we looked at all the energy consuming sectors. So we looked at industry, we looked at transport, of course, we looked at electricity generation, but we also looked at buildings and did the analysis of what it would take to get to net zero in each one, and of course, collectively. And so to answer your question, I really, just start with a few key observations from what we found from the study. And that is, the first thing is that a central part of the strategy, and particularly for the power sector, which is a major source of emissions today, is to replace the fossil fuel generation that we have in the power sector with generation from zero carbon or low carbon resources, mainly from wind and solar, also nuclear, also other renewables, but mainly wind and solar. And then use electricity from that low carbon electricity sector to replace fossil fuels in end use. That makes electrification a particularly important strategy. So electricity, which today only accounts for 20% of the electricity we use in end use, like that's not just in buildings, but in industry, in transportation. It's only 20% today. It rises to over 50% by 2050 in our scenario. Electrification is a particularly important tool for getting to net zero in the building sector, and particularly in space and water heating. Electric heat pumps replacing fossil fuel heating and water heating. And electrification and energy efficiency together account for over 70% of the emissions reductions globally from the building sector in our scenario. So if you start to go down the path that we have the net zero 2050 scenario that we have, you end up with power systems that are heavily reliant on wind and solar power. And that's because wind and solar are much cheaper than the other low carbon options. And because they are variable sources, we're going to need other resources which are flexible to deal with the situation where the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining. And we estimate with our definition of how we define power system flexibility, we're going to need globally about 4 times the flexible resources we have today. And while some of it will be other flexible generation like hydropower, like biofuels and that kind of thing, we estimate about 1/4 of all the flexibility we're going to need in 2050 needs to come from demand response. Now that demand response could come from industry. We think some of it will. Also come from electric vehicles, because we have, we have 1 billion or 2 electric vehicles driving around by the year 2050. But buildings also have a very important role here. So that's what the study tells us. So how does it relate to where we are today? Well, we're seeing globally and in many countries, good progress in adding renewables. And a lot of it is wind and solar. Although the rates haven't been fast enough globally to actually cut to meet the increasing global power demand. And you also see, especially in the more advanced economies, steps to close some of their traditional generation, like Ontario's done here with coal plants. You also see others closing nuclear power plants as well. So what that means with all this variable generation coming up and some of the traditional generation that supported that flexibility going away, the need for flexible resources, including demand response, is going to grow quite quickly, especially if coming out of COP26, there's going to be a renewed emphasis on adding renewables even more quickly. So that's going to really going to increase the demand for the kind of flexibility services that the various sectors, including the building sector, can provide. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that global perspective. And perhaps we can move now to focus more specifically on Ontario. And I want to pose a question to Katherine. You're obviously you are a leader in innovation in the Ontario energy sector, electricity sector. And given that, where do you see the sector heading in Ontario with respect to the sector's role in addressing climate change? And specifically, what do you see, again, having regard specifically to the circumstances in Ontario, what do you see about the role that the building sector can play?
Yeah, thanks, Hans. So there are a few things coming together over the next 10 years in Ontario. First of all, Pickering is going, one of our big nuclear facilities is going to retire. The two other facilities are being refurbished. And we're seeing significant increase in customer demand over the next decade. And this is largely driven by customer electrification and clean energy targets. There are a number of corporations, most major corporations now who have clean energy goals, many of whom are looking at our net zero by 2050. And there are also an increasing number of communities who are expressing energy preferences. Many of you will have seen the gas phase out study that the IESO published earlier this month. And that study was a response to a request from a number of communities to look at the potential to phase out gas from the electricity system. And what I would say is that I think that's an important question in terms of the potential to phase out gas from the electricity system. But our electricity system here in Ontario is 93%, give or take, emissions free, and we can all be very proud of that because that's been, an effort, an accomplishment that's been achieved with the building sector, with industrial customers, with residential customers. It's taken a lift by everyone across the province, and it's something that we can be very proud of as Ontarians. What I would say then is that is a huge clean energy benefit, right? And so when I think about your question in terms of what role the electricity sector is going to play going forward, I mean, what you're seeing is electrification. You're seeing folks turn to the electricity system as the low carbon energy provider that's going to help them and support them in achieving those climate goals and those clean energy goals. And so that's a tremendous opportunity to leverage the clean energy investments that have been made in this province. It also brings additional challenges for us as the grid operator, as the entity responsible for maintaining the reliability of the province and in running the wholesale electricity markets, in terms of making sure that we can continue to meet that demand in light of the nuclear retirement and the refurbishments that I talked about. And a key way that we're going to do that is to enable new resources into our system, to take advantage of emerging technology like storage, like hybrid generation storage, pairings, and distributed energy resources. So customer-sited storage, customer-sited generation, the demand response potential that Peter mentioned earlier. And we're really seeing a proliferation of those resources at the customer level, at the community level. And we've only just scratched the surface in terms of how they can contribute to meeting Ontario's reliability needs. And that's the same, with systems around the world. So I think the potential is tremendous in terms of enabling those distributed energy resources, those customer and community-sided resources, to contribute more fully to meeting customer and community energy needs, in terms of really enabling them to provide the range of electricity products and services that they're able to provide in our markets. And doing so is not only going to solve our reliability challenges and enable the clean energy goals that so many customers have. It's also going to create new revenue sources for customers, for building owners, for building occupants, in terms of lending the potential of their storage unit, or their ability to adjust their demand on the hottest and coldest days through demand response, or to leverage generation that might be sited on site to contribute to meeting those reliability needs and make some market revenues in the process.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And I'm going to turn now to Imran. And Katherine, in her remarks, highlighted the growing importance or potential importance of distributed energy resources in the Ontario market. And I know that Peak has been very active in that sector, particularly in the building sector. And with that in mind, I'd really like to have your perspective on what you see, I mean, as a developer, what you see as the potential for the sector, and more specifically, what changes you think are needed in order to facilitate the deployment of the types of technologies that Katherine described.
Thanks, Alec. Yeah, I think we have a unique perspective because we're doing virtual power plants of buildings in Toronto, in Ontario and New York, and soon to be California as well. But what our experience has shown us is really there's sort of two key considerations and impediments, which is around increasing the revenue streams from the system operator utility side, and it's around tying energy and GHG together, or energy and non-energy benefits together. And so first I'll sort of describe what the potential of buildings are, and then I'll get into each of those two in a little bit more detail. So what we're finding is that you can unlock the latent capacity, as Katherine had pointed out, right? And Peter had talked about flexibility. So you can actually have virtual power plants of buildings providing this grid flexibility, as long as you think of a building not as like a static one-way user of energy, but as a bidirectional asset to the grid. And I like to simplify it by basically saying you can put a battery into a building, that's stationary storage. You can have electric vehicles connected to the grid, that's mobile storage, or you can have synthetic storage, which is basically using, like, let's say IoT sensors, like a Fitbit for your building, so to say, and then reducing and manipulating consumption at specific times to be able to offer grid benefit. And what is really interesting is that the building sector likes this, because we're not just telling them that, hey, we can help you with kilowatt hour reduction of energy within your building that saves money, but by offering grid services, you can actually generate revenue. And so what the sector is now realizing is that the contributors to climate change, the building sector, the transport sector, can now be contributors to climate change and get paid to do so. And so that really leads me to, how do you help bridge that gap, right? So the first was around increasing revenue streams. So I think when we think about grid services, right, like we traditionally think of, let's say, conservation, demand response, right? And conservation is focused on kilowatt hour savings. And that's a revenue stream that is well defined since the 80s in Ontario, really, with the oil embargo and gas, and then we moved it to electricity. So that's well defined, and it's something we can leverage. Kilowatt hour savings, absolutely. But let's take it to the next stage. Demand savings, kilowatt savings, right? We're talking about capacity. That and revenue streams associated to that would be of benefit to the sector as well. And then the third is just pure revenue generation, right? Demand response and things that we currently have, in increasing the number of services that buildings can provide. One of the fundamental issues right now is this is a unique and novel concept. It's new to the sector. So we do need a little bit of subsidization of innovation within the space. And one thing that we're finding is feedback from customers is there's a missing gap between GHG and energy. And the reason for that is the OEB, the IESO, they're creatures of administrative law, right? Their enabling acts don't have GHG targets in there. So they aren't directed to basically say, hey, look, we have GHG targets we need to hit. So even if you think of the CDM programs that would offer subsidization, they're not looking at GHG. Yet the sector, the REITs, the institutional investors are all signing up to ESG targets now and asking their portfolio companies, what are your GHG numbers? Not what are your energy savings? And so there needs to be a link between the two, between energy and non-energy benefits. And I think we're starting to see this emergence globally. These discussions are now happening. This is a discussion as well around that. And I think, the IEA has said it well, the energy sector holds the key. And I absolutely believe that it's true. The energy sector holds the key to climate change. We just have to now forge that link in a financial manner.
Thank you very much, Imran. And we're going to turn now to our fourth speaker, Ali Haas. I mean, you're the one person who's actually in the building sector, and so you bring a very important perspective to this discussion, Ali. And the question I have for you is, when you reflect on your own business and on your own commitment to sustainability and environmental performance, what do you see as the main barriers, whether they be financial or otherwise, organizational barriers to achieving innovation and the deployment of the types of technologies that Imran and Katherine have spoken about?
Thank you, Alec. Good afternoon, everyone. So basically what we are seeing in the market nowadays, like most of our investment decision or acquisition decisions is based upon ESG targets. And we basically take into account climate risk assessment into our investment decision making. So something like it is basically a dilemma we have. We see continued economic and population growth, which basically drive the consumption higher. And while we are all trying to basically phasing out fossil fuels, and we're going through massive like energy system transition. So basically we need more energy in terms of new investment, but we're phasing out fossil fuels. Like what we see, this cause a Caesar effect, and which requires massive investment for which customers and ratepayers at the end of the day, they have to pay for it. So as Imran mentioned, it is very important, and I really want to emphasize is the alignment between whatever target and objectives we have. So different government agencies, the building sector, we need to be aligned in terms of what kind of ESG objectives we are putting together and we are trying to achieve. Most of the time, so in the energy industry, and as it relates to the building, we have supply and we have demand. Most of the time, we are talking about electrification, we're talking about transition to renewable generation, but I think we have to put more emphasis on demand. And the way I look at it, I look at energy efficiency as the first renewable energy, basically. So something basically we can, and specifically very important, when we are going to electrification, we need buildings to be more efficient. We need our new construction to be more aligned with the passive house design to make sure the amount of electrification is going to be minimized in terms of how much energy we need. So in a nutshell, so if we try to combine energy efficiency and demand flexibility, and we can define a sort of a grid connected, efficient buildings, we can transform buildings into a clean and flexible resource. So something I've been very passionate about is basically utilizing energy efficiency as a resource. We can combine, which actually combined with a smart technology, we can deliver greater affordability, we can improve our performance, and we can make sure we are cautious about affordability at the same time. So time and location-based energy efficiency is a way to go. We can align those concepts to the environmental objectives, and we can basically support our zero energy targets. So digitization, smart energy management, combine all together, basically we can transform the way we are basically operating our buildings. And nowadays, from the investment perspective, there is no lack of resources or investment. It's a matter of we are looking at the return on investment, not only from economic perspective, but we have to collectively as an industry put a value on resiliency, put a value on beyond carbon tax, on some sort of how we basically look at the buildings under the umbrella of environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and sustainable governance.
unmute myself here. Thank you very much for that. And I perhaps while we're waiting for questions from the audience, if I could pick up on one word and one theme from your remarks, and perhaps invite the other panelists to reflect on it. One word that stuck out was the word alignment, and alignment among a number of goals: affordability, energy efficiency, carbon reduction. And the question in my mind is, what is the best way? What are the tools for achieving that alignment? I mean, is that alignment something that you anticipate would be achieved by industry on its own? Or is there a need for a new regulatory system or rules that would help guide industry to achieve the alignment that you've described? Perhaps you might address that first, Ali, but I'd be interested in hearing from the other panelists as well.
Sure, absolutely. So I really want to be very specific. So I think Ontarians, specifically, like if you look at Ontario, we have to be allowed to purchase the Ontario surplus electricity during off-peak hours. So we are basically in 2019, we curtailed about 6.5 terawatt hours of clean electricity and sold about 19.8 terawatt hours of electricity to New York, to Chicago. So I think we have to change a regulation, work with ISO, work with OEB, so we can utilize technology Imran is providing to the market, battery storage, getting that clean electricity off-peak hours and utilize it in on-peak hours when we have basically fossil fuel generators kick in, and we can basically achieve killing two birds with one stone, basically reducing our carbon footprint. At the same time, we can make sure everybody, Ontarians, there have access to clean and cheap electricity.
Ron, I saw you nodding your head. So I took that as an indication you had something you'd like to share.
Yeah, sure. I think, if we look at what's really positive, we have a clean grid, right? Like we should all be proud of it, as Katherine said, right? We've got a very good framework for stakeholder consultation here in Ontario. What we don't have right now is something that ties GHG to energy. And if we look at, really our two options is, one is an update to the OEB Act, to the Enabling Act, or the other is a directive, right? Or let's say there's like sort of this midpoint as well, which is really the work around innovation that Katherine's team is doing. Like if you look at the ISO, the OEB Grid Innovation Fund applications, right? There's an opportunity to explore what happens if you start asking participants to look at GHG or report on it. So you start to generate information on what could be achievable that can then lead to either an administrative law change or a directive or whatever is needed in the sector to get us to a certain point. So, we have these mini little hurdles that we can start to do if you want to get a little bit more specific, that I think would create alignment. And the alignment really just comes from GHG quantification. That's what we're missing.
Katherine, would you like to weigh in at all, or wait for questions?
Yeah, no, sure, I would. So I think a couple points. I mean, one, sort of as I said at the beginning, we're seeing a period where surpluses are diminishing, right? Given the increase in demand and the retirement of assets. So I think that's important to point out. And you always want, there'll be a bit of a surplus in a healthy system, because that's reflective of something that can accommodate a system that can respond to those unpredictables, right? The resilience that you want, a system that Ali referenced. I mean, I think the other sort of thing I would sort of say is, through the Industrial Conservation Initiative, we've seen the power of price, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to see anything that would, I'd be leery of policy that would drive up the price of electricity by specifying certain technologies or what have you. I don't think that's going to solve the challenge. And we saw sort of the backlash to the Green Energy Act, over the last 15 years, right? When folks did see prices increase. But what I would say is that we've seen how exposure to price, as exemplified by the Industrial Conservation Initiative, drives innovation, right? Drives customer-led innovation. And you saw really the proliferation of the battery sector and battery technology in this province because of that exposure to price signals and the ability to leverage technology to arbitrage. So I think that there's a lot, I think there's a lot that we can learn from other jurisdictions in that area, being mindful of different ability to pay in different customer segments. But for those who are, are willing to take on that, that sort of ability to see and be exposed to those price signals in exchange for adopting the innovation to do something about that exposure, you have seen the rewards.
Peter, we actually have a number of questions now from the audience, and the first question is actually directed specifically to you.
Okay.
So I will pose the question to you, and I'll give you some background. This is in fact from a professional in the reliable energy sector, and the question for you is follows: European states, leaders in energy decarbonization like the UK and Germany are currently going through an energy crisis, which is somewhat being attributed to their transition to renewable energy. How would you comment on the contribution of renewable energy into this European energy crisis, and what needs to be done to avoid it in the future?
Okay, well, great question. It's actually something we have been commenting on publicly in the last few weeks. The first point we make is that we don't see that link between the clean energy transitions and the current issues, which are really driven by global natural gas demand. I'd say the underlying thing is like natural gas demand this year is going up a lot. In Europe, rebounding from last year, which was a very different year, and a much colder winter. In Asia, China's been going very strong, but other countries too. And the world's gas system is now closely linked together thanks to all this liquefied natural gas. And so it's really a more basic demand and supply story is what we see happening. And because gas is used as a marginal fuel to make electricity, it sets the electricity price in places like the UK and Germany. And this is what's really been driving what's been going on in recent months. Now, if you actually move ahead to a place where relatively little gas, even where Ontario is today, is being used to generate electricity, the story becomes somewhat different than where these systems are today. So but doesn't mean that we aren't going to see more tightness going into the future. I think gas and oil and other investment is slowing down. Renewables investment is picking up, but this renewables investment is not picking up fast enough or efficiency investment to make this transition smooth and cheap as we would like to see it in an ideal world. We think the real world is going to be much more messy, but we think the first response is, well, invest more in efficiency, invest more in renewables, get down the road of the clean energy transition rather than turning that investment back into fossil fuel.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's a question I think that picks up to some extent your comments, and it's actually a question from, if I can say, from Terry Young, who is the former interim president of the ISO, and great comments, but would be interested in knowing what's the capacity of the building sector to take up the challenge that we've talked about today. And if that capacity is lacking, which it may well be, how do you start to build that capacity? That, it seems to me, is almost the fundamental theme of the talk, but it's worth getting a sense of how do we build capacity, understanding, et cetera, within the building sector. Perhaps Ali and Imran, you may be in a position to start the discussion on that question.
Okay, perfect. This is a very good question. I think it all goes back from the building industry to tenant experience. So whatever we are achieving, whatever we want to do, is like we want to make sure it is it is based on the foundation of socioeconomic metrics. So there is no doubt rushing into setting targets, which what we are seeing like in peers in the industry, we are getting too passionate about setting targets that might not be cheap to be practically achieved. So from the building sector, I think we needed some alignment between defining building code, energy code, with a basically new construction. We have to move forward with basically making passive house design more prevalent in the new construction industry and in the existing building industry. I think we have to create an environment so the private investor can chip in, which is being coupled with a sort of regulatory incentive, tax credit, or maybe some sort of collaboration with government agency to basically pick up the sort of, specifically for a Class B industry, that we are far behind the game in terms of adaptation of the climate change metrics. So we can basically rejuvenate the whole industry, and we can basically push the industry to net zero carbon.
Yeah, I'll add to this. I think the big hurdle right now is financing, and it's financing from the perspective of innovative financing. So when you talk to the sector, you know, I cringe every time we get into a stakeholder call and people say, well, the insurance sector may pick up the tab. Stop, right? They're not going to, right? The reality is what's unique about the energy sector is we have always had an avoided cost model. So in other words, help us avoid $1 billion worth of infrastructure costs, and let's say we'll pay you 100 million. I'm just making up numbers here, right? But that stream of revenue is what's led to things like demand response, conservation, et cetera, right? And what's unique now is we can take that funding and give it to renewable energy or people providing flexibility services. So it doesn't have to go to the typical players, let's say the gas gens, et cetera, right? So now you've got a building that could be doing well for the environment and getting paid to do so. You've got alignment here, right? You've got an incentive for a building to invest in technologies with a dependable revenue stream. And by doing that, basically you're switching the sector from a cost savings mentality to a revenue generation mentality. And we've seen this firsthand in other sectors, right? Like take the auto sector, the manufacturing sector, like auto car manufacturing sector. They've always thought about cost cutting measures. And you know, how do I get something to be produced at the cheapest? As soon as you started to introduce things like Sirius radio and navigation systems, they switched to infotainment. Oh, revenue generation potential. And they stopped focusing on cost reduction as like the Six Sigma of being, right? And so similarly, the building sector will start to switch into environmental benefit as soon as there's a revenue generation potential. And they'll switch from kilowatt hours to kilowatts and to revenue generation. That's my hypothesis. And I think we're seeing it play out in real time too.
Can I just, I won't weigh in, you know, I totally defer to Ali and Imran on what the building sector needs. What I would say is we need the building sector. We need the building sector involved in these conversations. And I'll say something that would make me not so popular in, you know, another forum, if it was a more of a traditional energy electricity forum. There is a lot wrapped up in the status quo, right? There are a lot of folks who have a lot of resources committed to engaging in, and rightfully so, but in the energy regulatory sphere, in our engagements, right, around how electricity markets evolve. And the thing about the huge potential in customer connected resources is that there's a lot of building owners, there's a lot of occupants. And so it's kind of, you know, in some ways I know harder to rally the troops, right? But oh my goodness, is the army huge, right? When you put it all together. And so what we really need is just to show up and to express that potential and to help shape the future and to shape and say, you know what, we need to enable these resources, you know, more quickly. We need to enable this potential because it is so massive. That's what we need to hear from the building sector, and to really take that place in these discussions that I think that customer connected resources in the building sector rightfully has, to all the points that Imran and Ali have made.
Katherine, I have a question that I think follows on from the comments you just made, directed specifically to you. And it's really a question: what demonstration projects are currently underway And what is missing to build the business case for integrating demand response services provided for the building sector into the energy sector in Canada? And in your view, what is the biggest impediment at this time to reach that integration?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Alex, I mean, we have probably 30 active demonstration projects underway that are funded in part through the ISO's Grid Innovation Fund. We have an incredible project underway with P-Power, looking at how we can leverage that flexibility potential in office buildings. We have another pilot underway with Marshall Homes out in Pickering, looking at how we can leverage the flexibility of residential assets and battery and charging capacity. We really do have, a range of pilots underway looking at how we can leverage those customer connected assets to provide different products and services. And I would say that we have a lot of experience with demand response. I think there's even more though that beyond capacity that these products can provide. And when you look south of the border and you look at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and what they've required of all U.S. system operators and wholesale market administrators, they've said you need to fully enable distributed energy resources for all the products and services that they can provide. Energy, capacity, the suite of ancillary services, right? And that's because there is that potential. And because when you look at, when you are enabled in those markets and you have that potential to stack those revenues, then we've heard very clearly from asset owners that that's when you can really make the business case work. So I think in terms of what we need to do going forward, I'll put in a plug. We have a call for proposals with the Ontario Energy Board through their Innovation Sandbox and our Green Innovation Fund that we're just about to open November 1st for projects that will look at implementing distributed energy resources into the grid to provide both distribution level and wholesale level services, and to look at different approaches to aggregating those resources so that they can provide flexibility locally and provide capacity, energy, ramping sort of the array of ancillary services that we're looking to purchase at the wholesale level, and figure out some of the challenges around coordination between local distributors and the ISO from a wholesale market perspective. And so I think that that's going to really give us that next sort of step in terms of identifying how we can get those new aggregation models, how we can get those new models for distributed energy resource integration or distributed energy resource participation into our markets over the next several years, so that we can meet those reliability challenges we talked about earlier.
I think the word tax has arisen once in the context of discussion so far, but not perhaps in the way I anticipated. But we do have a question from El Halabi about what role does a carbon tax play in all this? Is that a key component of achieving the objectives that we're talking about? And perhaps, Peter, I'm sure you have a perspective on that you might be prepared to share.
Well, certainly, Alec. In the first instance, we think carbon pricing is an important part of the transition. And we see it not just in Canada, but in a number of countries around the world. They've even introduced the world's largest carbon market in China now. So it's becoming a very, very common tool to influence behavior. And as in our study, when we're talking about electrification, it's important that the carbon cost of the fossil fuels get reflected somehow to the end user, so the end users can start to think about electrification actually might be a cheaper route to go. So I think taxation has that effect. Interesting right now, and it reflects the previous question you asked me. One of the responses of governments in Europe to the higher power prices they're seeing is to take some of the carbon tax revenue and give it as a temporary benefit to customers to deal with their higher bills, not from the carbon tax, but just from the high prices in the market right now. So it's also a funding resource that can be used in situations like this.
Any other perspectives on, Ali, you I think may have a perspective on carbon pricing.
Absolutely. So I would say in all our deep retrofit projects, So when we are doing a sort of putting a business case together, we are doing life cycle cost analysis. Carbon pricing is only factor make the whole sort of a deep project feasible and viable. So if we discount for the carbon pricing and the projection of the increase in carbon tax over the next 20 years, so we're going to have a difficulty in terms of justifying implementing projects from economic perspective. I think carbon pricing is really important, but we have to make sure, like, in the ESG market, we have too much attention in environmental sustainability. I'm personally, as an immigrant, I'm so super passionate about social responsibility and affordability. We need to think seriously about it. So if we have a massive and rapid transition to zero carbon economy, we have to account for probably portion of the revenue from carbon tax needs to be reinvested into affordable housing. We want to make sure we are not leaving part of the population behind in terms of going through this massive transition.
I'm very conscious of time, and I did mention that I wanted to give every member of the panel an opportunity to share some concluding remarks. But before doing so, if I can just perhaps raise two themes that I think have come out of today's discussion that I would certainly invite you to reflect on and perhaps comment on. And Ali, two words again that have come out of your comments and have been reflected in the comments of others. And one is the need for alignment going forward, the need to align the emphasis on efficiency, sustainability, and that has to be aligned not only with opportunities for revenue generation, and as you say, respect for those who may bear impacts. And so there has to be alignment, a degree of an alignment. And secondly, I think it's clear there needs to be a greater pursuit of collaboration, perhaps among agencies who have not collaborated before or as fully as they might, and perhaps collaboration among sectors who have not collaborated before, or perhaps not as much as they could have. So I'd be very interested in perhaps getting your closing remarks upon those two themes: one, alignment, and collaboration. How do we achieve the alignment? How do we achieve the collaboration, which is needed, I think, to achieve the objectives we're talking about? Imran, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think I really view it as, on one hand, we need more representation. I think Katherine said it as well, right? Like, hey, building sector, tell us what you can do, right? And I think that, panels like this is very good, expanded agendas, let's say BOMA, et cetera, right? To represent the building sector and what the potential of the building sector is, right? And I think we currently have that missing in the market. So that would definitely help in terms of collaboration, right? A common language, data to be able to work through. And then in terms of alignment, I kind of still take it back to GHG and financial considerations, right? We have to understand not just the needs of the grid, but the needs of the investors, the needs of the people investing in these technologies and owning these buildings. And if you want them to be a part of the solution, we have to ensure that there's alignment by the financial and the GHG numbers coming together.
Katherine?
Yeah, thanks. I think Imran said it really well. I would just say get engaged and show up, right? The Ontario electricity market is a $15 billion a year market. We buy electricity, every minute, every hour, every day. So it's, there are constantly opportunities, and we're in a place now, like I said earlier, where we're looking to procure a significant amount of capacity to meet the growing needs of the province over the next decade. So it can be, for those who don't have as much experience, it can be a little bit daunting at first to learn about how the different procurements and markets work. But we have folks who support our market participants who help them through the different processes. And there are a number of building owners and operators who participate directly in those markets or in those procurements. So I would encourage you, when you know what's on the table and you know what you have in terms of your own energy targets, to really look kind of internally at how you might be able to support the solutions that the province is going to need over the next decade, and potentially make some money doing it.
Peter, if I could pose a question to you, where we've talked about collaboration, obviously, in the context of Ontario and particular parts of the sector in Ontario, but do you see an opportunity for greater international? Obviously, we have COP26, but is there an opportunity for learnings, particularly, let's say, in the energy sector internationally?
Well, certainly we see a lot of those discussions going on, Alec. Actually, much more, I would say, in the industry sectors right now than we see in the buildings, because everybody's got their own stock and their own particular kinds of issues. But you do see, for example, within Europe, some of this going on. But another area actually that they're trying to build more collaboration is in the regulatory side. And I can't reveal details because it's going to be announced at COP next week. But Ofgem, who Alec you know well, will be announcing an energy transition accelerator, where it's going to try to engage with regulators to figure out what their role is supposed to be in accelerating the transition. I think some of the barriers that have been identified here, and I think Ofgem recognizes, they realize are regulatory and are related to the fact of trying to get using Imran's framing of getting the lowest cost which is not necessarily equal to the best value for consumers, to a system that's going to become much more electrical in the future. So I think that's an interesting discussion to have, because you always need to take a step back, just even from the power sector, and say, where's the power sector fit into society? And 120 years ago, the power sector had this very great influence on industrializing Canadian society, and it's poised to have that kind of influence in decarbonizing that society in the 21st century. So it has kind of a social purpose again that it had when it started out. So I think when you take that broader perspective, I think some of the issues about alignment start to fall away if you realize that that's what the role of the power sector is going to have. But that's sort of a higher level recognition that has to happen first before you can do all these other things.
Ali, I'm happy to give you the last word before I turn matters back to Walter to wrap up today's session.
Perfect. Thank you, Alec. I think the zero carbon economy of the future requires a different kind of workforce. I think one of the major area of collaboration is creating an environment that can train the future workforce for this zero carbon economy. And I think like nowadays, sometimes, like as somebody like working for past 15 years in environmental sustainability, I think we are all collectively, we need to challenge the status quo. We have to basically talk about new opportunities, going out of the box, understanding the new opportunities, trying to basically accommodate new innovative project. And my last comment is going to be like, I think we have to change our perspective about the impact of climate change. So we know it is going to be scary if we don't do anything about climate change, but I think the attitude of pessimism creates anger and resentment, which is against the collaboration. I think collectively we have to be passionate about our capacity and capability. We have to understand the fact in every aspect of society, we are better off compared to our grandparents, and we take the opportunity, utilize the resources, and collectively work together toward achieving whatever target we have in the future. I think that sense of optimism creates a sort of a massive passion that everybody can work together and can achieve greatness together.
Well, what a great point on which to conclude the discussion. And so, Alta, I'm going to turn this back to you to conclude the program.
Thank you so much to our panelists for a great discussion, and that has been echoed by so many participants in the chat. My key takeaway is that the regulatory policymakers are listening, so let's make sure, everyone, that we share our knowledge and we sit at the table and properly show up. And I'm going to echo again Ali's comment that we should be more optimistic and take this great opportunity that we have in front of us. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I would kindly ask you to take a look at the survey that we just shared on the chat box. We look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.